Hi, my name is Trinity Wentz, and I picked the ethical question: Are sports betting ads getting out of control in Canada? So, for our agenda today, this presentation will follow the sequence of an introduction, explanation of the primary unethical issue, facts regarding this issue, a stakeholder analysis, an analysis of possible strategies to resolve the issue, an explanation of my go forward strategy, and to conclude, my references. So, sports betting ads have become a noticeable feature of sports broadcasts when viewers tune in on TV or even spot when attending the live events. Ben Grandmont of Kitchener, Ontario, commented he noticed these ads were particularly bad during an NHL playoff season game when there were almost 8.5 minutes of sports gambling advertising. Arguments against these ads are that the volume has reached an excessive level and normalizing gambling poses a risk to vulnerable groups. Arguments for these ads are that they are a legitimate way to inform viewers about regulated betting options and they are an enjoyable aspect of watching sports. When answering the question of whether or not sports betting ads are getting out of control in Canada, I believe it is important to take into consideration the balance between industry promotion, consumer protection, and social responsibility to evaluate whether current advertising practices align with the public's best interests. So, with this being said, the primary issue of sports betting ads is their use of persuasive tactics. This is unethical because it specifically leverages the psychological tactics that downplay the risks of gambling and deceive people by leading them to believe gambling is easy or a safe way to make money. These ads emphasize the thrill of winning without highlighting the potential for significant financial loss or addiction, which is misleading and can be extremely harmful to vulnerable individuals with gambling addictions. So, a little bit of an overview is that with sports betting ads, there is a demonstration of information asymmetry. And as Kuzis and Posner describe, information asymmetry is a situation in which one party has information that another party does not have. And then, therefore, the person with more information has an advantage over the less informed party in any debate, negotiation, or transactions, such as the gambling. And in this way, advertisers fail to provide balanced information about the low probability of winning and the risk of addiction with the thrill of the win. So this leaves consumers at a significant informational disadvantage. Now, some facts. Cambridge Behavioral Health explains in a review of more than 140 studies and reports on the connections between sports betting and gambling addiction. The National Council on Problem Gambling found that the rate of gambling problems among sports bettors is at least twice as high as among gamblers in general. 45% of sports betting now takes place online. This is problematic because online gambling is available 24/7, and this makes it extremely convenient and provide more privacy. People who play sports bets on mobile devices have a higher incidence of unhealthy gambling behaviors. Young people have high rates of gambling problems than adults. 75% of students gambled, according to data from 2018. As online sports bets become more accessible and socially acceptable, particularly among young players, we can expect these problems to get worse. Aggressive advertising also makes it more difficult for sports bettors who are trying to reduce or stop their gambling. So, why do people engage in sports betting? Well, the majority, 45%, of Cambridge's survey respondents answered they engaged in sports betting because it makes watching the sport more interesting, which can be defined as an autonomous desire that the respondents of the survey want to maintain after reflection, not rationally thinking about the decision, but instead depending on the emotional thrill it produces to guide their decision to engage. And the stakeholders of this issue are advertisers and companies who create and endorse betting ads for the sole purpose of maximizing profit from consumer engagement, which means they completely ignore the ethical considerations at the consumer's expense. There's vulnerable consumer groups, such as young viewers, who are extremely impressionable and easily influenced by celebrity endorsements, such as Connor McDavid, as you've seen in some of the pictures on previous slides, as well as individuals at risk of gambling addiction or who have limited financial literacy and could easily suffer from entertaining these ads. The third stakeholder group is government and regulators because they benefit from the tax revenue, which they claim they use to generate funds or for worthwhile causes. However, government also bears the societal costs of addressing gambling addiction and related harms, so this can be a negative for them. So, my first strategy that is a status quo strategy is to deter the negative externalities that sports betting ads persuasive tactics have on stakeholders and overall society by creating clear messaging advertising standards. So, this will improve betting companies and advertising companies' corporate social responsibility, as they will be able to still make profit, but they will have to think more critically about the impact that their ads messages have on the well being of society. And this will involve prohibiting deceptive promotions like risk-free bets, unless the terms are straightforward and articulated specifically. Explicit warnings about the risks of gambling, such as addiction or financial loss, would also be included in these standards to make sure there's no information asymmetries. Then we have my alternative strategy one, which is behavioral design interventions. This involves using loss framing. So the pros would be the loss framing through real life stories or losses or addiction present realistic outcomes of betting and counterbalance the allure of winning. The cons of this are the loss of profit for the betting companies, but the consequences overall between the pros and cons would be the vulnerable groups may decide to use these apps regardless. So that could be a con because they still continue to use the sports betting apps. However, betting companies can also go under, which it would also be a pro. Looking at it from the perspective of somebody who's completely against these ads, but a con looking from it in a fair market perspective. And consumers are given full information from these loss framing stories. So that's always a pro because then they're given full information. The next strategy that I have is limits on ad frequency. So this tactic would introduce caps on how frequently betting ads can appear during broadcasts or online. The pro would be this reduces overexposure and manipulation from frequency. The cons would be reduced viewing of ads for the betting companies, which means lost profit again. And the consequences between the pros and cons are this does not really solve the issue of betting companies using persuasive tactics. However, less people become knowledgeable of the betting companies from the reduced frequency. And then my third strategy is a social impact fund contribution from betting companies that require the companies to fund anti-addiction initiatives proportionate to their ad spending. So a pro of this is, as RAFET 2024 explains, the betting companies deliberately have to think about and show how they measure the social impact of their affairs, which would demonstrate their achievements and increase transparency, accountability, and legitimacy of their actions. So I think this would reduce the negative externalities. The cons would be betting companies lose obviously a percentage of their profit. However, the consequences between the pros and the cons would be individuals get to clearly see how sports betting can be harmful through the company's action to enforce these funds because of the negative externalities on stakeholders requiring funding to these programs. However, the betting companies' reputations are still positively impacted because they prove they care about society's well-being and they get to maintain their advertising. So, after an evaluation of all of these strategies, the first strategy of clear ad standards would be very timely as it would result in legalities such as government or regulatory bodies needing to amend their existing laws and introduce new regulations for the ads. So, since this is so time consuming, it could be a strategy that we don't really necessarily want to implement. The legal challenges may arise within this process as well, and enforcement mechanisms like the self-regulated Canadian Code of Advertising Standards will need to be implemented for these sports betting and advertisers and companies to adhere to. Also, the moral outcome of requiring caveat emptor is not entirely favorable because it is on the consumer to examine the ad rationally before deciding to take part in it and what is being advertised with newfound clarity in sports betting ad standards. The next strategy to use behavioral design interventions would involve a lot of regulatory review. So ensuring new rules cohere with free speech and industry rights would just mean that we have to have a lot of regulatory teams input. And this strategy is more costly than the others as it does involve these regulatory teams and more time for research and development teams to incorporate and understand how to appropriate frame betting ads to audiences. And the moral outcome is positive, however, as social injustice is reduced because lost framing articulates the negative aspects of sports betting, and therefore no groups are disadvantaged from information asymmetry. Limits on ad frequency is a strategy that involves intense legal implications from broadcast and platform agreements to agreements with regulatory authorities. So the cost would just be imperative for betting advertisers and companies as they would see a complete decline in their profit from reduced exposure time. And it's not really fair uh, in a market perspective. So the moral outcome of game theory would also be a part of this, since it would include a lot of stakeholder autonomy because the players, the stakeholders, are able to individually choose the action they want to take based on the information available and the time limits put on the ads. And so each player has to be willing to accept the outcome of the action they take from seeing the ad. So, for example, in the case of the advertiser or the company, the action they take to include the specific information they deem acceptable within the time limit they have to advertise would be the action they take. So, my go forward strategy after evaluating the other strategies that I've come up with is the social impact fund contribution. So, from an analysis of my strategies, I believe the best strategy is this social impact fund contribution from sports betting companies' ads and third party advertisers to mitigate the persuasive tactics and information asymmetries of these ads. So, this strategy would demonstrate a weak fiduciary responsibility through the sports betting ads companies' efforts to maximize their profits secondary to creating ads that articulate these non-deceitful messages. So they won't be losing as high of a percentage of their profit if they do not incorporate such harmful messages that abide to society's well-being. This is because the strategy holds these companies financially accountable through funding these programs that directly address the potential societal injustice issues that they cause. And the percentage taken from the profit they accumulate through these advertisements will be a cost endured, as well as the regulatory team required to legally put this plan into action would be another cost that they endure. So, by allocating these resources to public education, addiction prevention, and responsible gambling initiatives, this strategy counters misleading messages and empowers consumers with accurate information while also supporting those affected by gambling harm. So, unlike bans or ad limits, it would balance economic activity with social responsibility and create that sustainable solution to reduce deceit and mitigate risks associated with consumers taking part in the betting activity. So then, weighing my go forward strategy of a social fund contribution from sports betting advertisers, the concept of dirty hands is the only drawback, as this strategy may allow betting companies to continue using those persuasive framing tactics while justifying their actions by contributing a percentage of the profit to programs such as public education, addiction prevention, and responsible gambling initiatives, which therefore would create a moral conflict. However, by leveraging these contributions for societal benefit, government and regulators can actively reduce the harm that they create while holding the sports betting industry accountable and demonstrating to the world the negative externalities of sports betting. So these sports betting companies and advertisers can still maintain their right to participate in the market, as we know it is likely not going away, but it is ensured the potential societal harm from the ads will decrease while working toward longer term solutions. So, in conclusion, I like this quote from Narena at Brock University, which states, "We want to create a responsible, well regulated market. No one wants to see this pushed back into the shadows. Just like with cannabis or with alcohol or any of the other sins in our society, we want responsible consumption." And I think this quote clearly articulates how sports betting is something that society decides to take part in. So, initiatives to make it safer and reduce the harms that it has on society are how we can make this business more ethical, since, as I mentioned previously, it is probably not likely that it will go away anytime soon. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.